why Hitler believed D-Day wasn't the real invasion. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history was already underway. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers were crossing the English Channel. Thousands of ships stretched from horizon to horizon. Aircraft filled the skies above northern France, while paratroopers had already landed behind German lines during the night. For most military commanders, such an attack would have left little room for doubt. Surely this had to be the invasion Germany had been expecting for years. Yet inside the German High Command, uncertainty remained. Some officers urgently requested that powerful armoured divisions be sent to Normandy immediately. Others argued that the landings were only the beginning of something much larger. Adolf Hitler himself continued to believe that the real Allied invasion had not yet begun. It sounds almost impossible today. How could anyone look at thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, and one of the largest military operations ever launched, and conclude that it was only a diversion? The answer lies in one of the greatest deception campaigns in military history. Months before the first Allied soldier stepped onto the beaches of Normandy, an invisible battle was already being fought across Europe. It wasn't fought with tanks or artillery. Instead, it relied on fake armies, double agents, false radio transmissions, inflatable vehicles, and carefully planted misinformation. The goal was remarkably simple: convince Germany to prepare for an invasion that would never come. The remarkable part is that it worked. Even after Allied troops secured beachheads in Normandy, German commanders continued holding back some of their strongest forces because they believed an even larger assault would soon strike elsewhere. That delay would prove costly. By the time Germany fully realized that Normandy was the main invasion, the Allies had already established a foothold that could no longer be eliminated. But to understand why Hitler reached that conclusion, we first need to go back several months. By early 1944, Germany had been at war for nearly 5 years. The situation had changed dramatically since the lightning victories of 1939 and 1940. In the east, the Soviet Union was steadily pushing German forces westward after devastating defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk. In Italy, Allied troops were advancing north after the fall of Mussolini's regime. Meanwhile, Allied bombers struck German factories, railways, oil facilities, and cities almost every day, gradually weakening Germany's ability to wage war. Hitler understood that another threat was approaching. Britain had become the staging ground for an enormous Allied military build-up. American soldiers arrived in ever-increasing numbers. New aircraft filled British airfields. Ships crowded ports along England's southern coast. An invasion of Western Europe was no longer a question of if, but when. The only mystery was where. German planners studied every possible landing site along the French coast. One location stood out above all others: the Pas de Calais. Located at the narrowest point of the English Channel, it offered the shortest crossing from England to France. Supplies could be transporting more quickly, air support would be easier to maintain, and reinforcements could arrive faster than anywhere else along the coast. To German commanders, it seemed like the obvious choice. Hitler agreed. As a result, enormous resources were devoted to defending that region. Heavy artillery batteries overlooked the channel. Concrete bunkers were reinforced. Minefields stretched across likely landing areas. Powerful Panzer divisions waited nearby, prepared to launch counterattacks against any Allied force attempting to establish a beachhead. Normandy, by comparison, received far less attention. Its beaches were wider, its roads were more limited, and the surrounding countryside appeared less suitable for supporting a massive invasion. While defences certainly existed there, many German commanders believed the Allies would never choose such a difficult location for their main assault. That assumption would become one of the most important decisions of the entire war. And the Allies intended to make sure Germany never questioned it. The deception had already begun. Operation Bodyguard, winning a battle before it began. By the beginning of 1944, Allied leaders understood that launching an invasion across the English Channel would be one of the riskiest operations in military history. Even if the landings succeeded, everything could still unravel within days. If German armoured divisions reached the beaches quickly enough, they might drive the Allied forces back into the sea before they could establish a secure foothold. The Allies needed more than overwhelming firepower, they needed time. The best way to gain that time was to convince Germany to send its strongest forces somewhere else. To achieve that goal, Allied planners created an ambitious deception campaign known as Operation Bodyguard ***. Rather than being a single operation, Bodyguard was an umbrella plan that combined dozens of smaller deception efforts. Some targeted German spies, others used fake radio traffic, misleading diplomatic signals, or carefully controlled leaks of information. Together, they all served one purpose: to hide the true location of the invasion. One of the most important parts of this plan was called Operation Fortitude ***. Fortitude itself was divided into two sections. Fortitude North attempted to convince Germany that the Allies planned to invade Norway. Although this deception tied down German troops in Scandinavia, it was Fortitude South that would have the greatest impact on the coming invasion of France. Fortitude South focused on one simple idea. Instead of convincing Germany that Normandy was safe, the Allies wanted German commanders to believe that the real invasion would take place at the Pas de Calais. It was an idea that played directly into German expectations. The Pas de Calais was the closest point between Britain and France. It offered the shortest sea crossing, easier supply routes, and a faster path toward Germany. To many German officers, it already seemed like the obvious place for an invasion. The Allies simply encouraged them to keep believing it. Across southeastern England, an army began to appear. From the air it looked enormous. Rows of tanks stood in open fields. Aircraft crowded makeshift airfields. Landing craft lined rivers and harbours. Supply depots seemed to grow larger every week. But there was one problem. Much of it wasn't real. Many of the tanks were inflatable rubber decoys. Wooden aircraft sat where real fighters should have been. Canvas-covered frames created the illusion of military vehicles from a distance. Even fake fuel storage sites were carefully constructed to fool aerial reconnaissance. From several thousand feet in the air, these decoys often looked convincing enough to support the story the Allies wanted Germany to believe. The deception extended far beyond what could be seen from the sky. Radio operators transmitted thousands of messages that mimicked the communications of large military formations. These messages were not random. They followed realistic schedules, used believable military terminology, and created the impression that hundreds of thousands of soldiers were preparing for an assault that did not actually exist. German intelligence intercepted many of these transmissions. To them, everything appeared consistent. The evidence seemed to point toward a massive force gathering opposite the Pas de Calais. Perhaps the greatest success of Operation Fortitude came through the use of double agents. Throughout the war, Germany relied on a network of spies operating in Britain. What German intelligence did not realize was that many of these agents had already been captured and turned by British intelligence. Instead of sending accurate reports back to Germany, they transmitted carefully crafted misinformation. Because these agents had built a record of reliability over time, their reports carried considerable weight. When they confirmed that the main invasion would strike the Pas de Calais, German intelligence had little reason to doubt them. Every new report seemed to reinforce the last. The deception became even more convincing through the creation of a fictional military formation, known as the **First United States Army Group **, often abbreviated as FUSAG. On paper, it appeared to be one of the largest Allied armies assembled during the war. Its assigned commander made the deception even more believable. General George S. Patton was widely regarded by the Germans as one of America's most aggressive and capable battlefield commanders. German planners expected that a commander of Patton's reputation would almost certainly lead the main invasion of France. Instead, Patton was deliberately kept away from Normandy before D-Day. His visible presence in southeastern England helped convince German intelligence that the fictional army under his command was preparing for the decisive assault at the Pas de Calais. Every piece of the deception supported every other piece. The fake tanks matched the fake radio traffic. The fake radio traffic matched the reports from double agents. Those reports matched what German commanders already believed about geography and military strategy. Instead of asking Germany to believe something unlikely, the Allies encouraged them to believe what already seemed logical. By the spring of 1944, the deception had become remarkably convincing. German reconnaissance photographs appeared to confirm the growing concentration of Allied forces opposite the Pas de Calais. Intercepted communications supported the same conclusion. Trusted intelligence sources reported the same thing. From the German perspective, the evidence pointed in one direction. If an invasion came, it would almost certainly come at the Pas de Calais. That confidence would shape German decisions on June 6, 1944. And even after Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, many German commanders continued to wonder whether they were witnessing the real invasion, or merely the opening move in a much larger plan. D-Day begins. Shortly after midnight on June 6, 1944, the invasion began. Long before the first landing craft reached the beaches, thousands of Allied paratroopers were already descending into the darkness behind German lines. Their mission was to seize bridges, disrupt communications, destroy key road junctions, and create as much confusion as possible before the main assault arrived. Not everything went according to plan. Many aircraft encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire. Thick clouds and poor visibility scattered entire units across the Norman countryside. Some soldiers landed miles from their intended drop zones. Others found themselves isolated, surrounded by unfamiliar hedgerows and enemy troops. Yet the unexpected dispersion had one surprising advantage. German commanders struggled to determine where the main attack was unfolding. Reports arrived from dozens of locations at once, making it difficult to distinguish isolated raids from a coordinated invasion. While the fighting intensified inland, an even larger force was approaching the French coast. More than 5,000 ships crossed the English Channel in what remains one of the largest naval operations ever assembled. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, minesweepers, and transport vessels stretched across the sea for miles. As dawn approached, Allied warships opened fire. The thunder of naval artillery echoed across the Normandy coastline as shells crashed into German gun batteries, bunkers, and defensive positions. Moments later, waves of bombers attacked many of the same targets from the air. Then came the landings. American forces headed toward Utah and Omaha Beach. British troops landed at Gold and Sword. Canadian forces assaulted Juneau. Each beach presented different challenges, but nowhere was the fighting more brutal than Omaha. Strong currents pushed landing craft off course. Many tanks sank before reaching shore. German machine guns swept the beaches while artillery shells exploded among soldiers struggling through the surf. Within minutes, casualties mounted. Some units became pinned behind obstacles and seawalls, unable to advance. Officers were killed. Radio operators fell. Entire formations lost contact with neighboring units. For a time, the outcome at Omaha remained uncertain. Elsewhere, however, the invasion progressed more smoothly. At Utah Beach, many landing craft drifted south of their planned positions. Ironically, this mistake placed American troops in an area that was less heavily defended than expected. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., who landed with the first wave despite walking with a cane, reportedly decided that the attack would simply begin from the new location. British and Canadian forces also pushed inland, though fierce resistance slowed their advance towards several key objectives. As reports poured into German headquarters throughout the morning, confusion spread. Some commanders immediately recognized the scale of the assault. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had spent months strengthening the Atlantic Wall, had repeatedly argued that any invasion had to be defeated on the beaches before the Allies could build up their strength. If the landings succeeded, he warned, Germany's chances would diminish rapidly. But Rommel wasn't at headquarters that morning. He had traveled back to Germany, partly to visit his wife on her birthday, and partly to continue discussions about improving coastal defenses. Other senior commanders also faced uncertainty. Was Normandy the long-expected invasion? Or was it exactly what Allied planners wanted Germany to think? German intelligence had spent months collecting evidence pointing toward the Pas de Calais. That evidence had not disappeared overnight simply because fighting had begun elsewhere. Some officers argued that Normandy represented a secondary landing, designed to draw German reserves away from the real objective. Others believed the Allies were testing German defences before launching their decisive attack across the narrowest part of the English Channel. The reports arriving from Normandy were alarming, but they did not erase months of intelligence suggesting that Pas de Calais remained the most likely target. The debate reached the highest levels of command. One question now mattered more than any other. Should Germany commit its powerful armoured reserves immediately? Or wait for what many still believed was the real invasion? The decision that could not be undone. To understand why Germany hesitated on one of the most important days of the war, it's necessary to understand how the German command structure worked. Unlike many Allied armies, Germany's armoured reserve was not controlled by a single commander. Several panzer divisions could only be released with Adolf Hitler's personal authorization. That arrangement had developed over time as Hitler became increasingly involved in military decision-making. Convinced that only he could make the most important strategic choices, he gradually centralized authority in his own hands. As a result, even experienced field commanders often found themselves waiting for permission instead of acting immediately. During the early hours of June 6, that system became a serious liability. Reports from Normandy continued to arrive throughout the morning. Some described isolated landings. Others spoke of thousands of enemy troops coming ashore. Still others suggested airborne forces had appeared far inland. The information was often incomplete, contradictory, and arriving faster than it could be verified. German commanders urgently debated whether to release the armoured reserves. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Germany's commander-in-chief in the West, recognized that speed would be critical. Every passing hour allowed the Allies to land more soldiers, more tanks, more artillery, and more supplies. Once a beachhead became firmly established, driving the invasion back into the sea would become vastly more difficult. Rommel had argued exactly this for months. He believed the war in France would be decided within the first 24 hours of any invasion. If German armour struck immediately, there might still be a chance. If it arrived too late, the opportunity would disappear forever. But another concern weighed heavily on the minds of many German commanders. What if Normandy wasn't the main invasion? Operation Fortitude had done its job almost perfectly. German intelligence still believed that a much larger Allied force remained in southeastern England. Reconnaissance reports, intercepted radio messages, and intelligence from trusted agents all continued to suggest that the Pas de Calais was the true objective. To German planners, it seemed entirely possible that the Normandy landings were designed to lure the panzer divisions away. If Germany committed everything to Normandy, and then an even larger Allied army landed at Pas de Calais, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Germans would have weakened the very sector they had spent years preparing to defend. It was exactly the dilemma the Allies had hoped to create. Every hour of hesitation worked in their favor. Meanwhile, the situation on the beaches was changing rapidly. Engineers began clearing obstacles that had blocked the landing craft. Additional waves of infantry reached shore. Field hospitals were established. Artillery pieces were unloaded. Bulldozers carved exits through seawalls and embankments. Despite fierce resistance, the invasion force continued to grow. By midday, thousands of additional soldiers had reached Normandy. By evening, it was tens of thousands. And they were only the beginning. Across the English Channel, an almost endless stream of ships continued making the crossing. Landing craft returned to Britain, loaded more men and equipment, and crossed again. The flow scarcely stopped. German air attacks achieved little against the overwhelming Allied naval presence. Attempts to disrupt the landings met determined resistance from Allied fighters that now dominated the skies. Years earlier, the Luftwaffe had terrorized Europe. By the summer of 1944, the balance had shifted dramatically. Allied aircraft patrolled the battlefield almost continuously. German vehicles moving during daylight risked immediate attack. Bridges, roads, railways, and supply columns were constantly threatened from above. Even when German armored units finally received orders to move, reaching the battlefield proved far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Columns advancing toward Normandy found themselves delayed by destroyed bridges, damaged roads, traffic congestion, and relentless air attacks. Every delay gave the Allies another opportunity to strengthen their position. The invasion had entered a race against time. Germany needed to crush the beachhead before it became unstoppable. The Allies needed only to survive long enough for their overwhelming numbers and industrial strength to take effect. With each passing hour, that goal came closer. And although many German commanders still believed another invasion might strike the Pas de Calais, the reality unfolding in Normandy was becoming impossible to ignore. The decisive battle for Western Europe had begun. Building the beachhead. By the end of June 6, the outcome of the invasion was still far from certain. Although the Allies had successfully landed tens of thousands of soldiers, their position remained fragile. In several areas, the beachheads were shallow, and many of the objectives planned for the first day had not yet been achieved. German forces continued launching local counterattacks wherever they could. Snipers occupied farmhouses overlooking narrow roads. Mortar crews fired from hidden positions behind thick hedgerows. Small groups of infantry fought fiercely for villages that, on a map, appeared almost insignificant but controlled vital crossroads. For the soldiers on the ground, every field and every hill mattered. The landscape of Normandy created challenges few Allied commanders had fully appreciated. Much of the countryside was divided by centuries-old hedgerows known as the bocage. These were not ordinary hedges. They consisted of thick banks of earth topped with dense vegetation, forming natural walls that often stood several feet high. Instead of fighting across open farmland, Allied troops found themselves advancing through a maze of narrow lanes and enclosed fields. Visibility was limited. German defenders could remain hidden until enemy soldiers were only a few yards away. Every hedgerow became another defensive line. Progress slowed dramatically. Despite these difficulties, the Allies possessed one enormous advantage. They controlled the sea. Every day, hundreds of additional ships crossed the English Channel carrying fresh troops, tanks, ammunition, fuel, food, engineering equipment, and medical supplies. The invasion was no longer a single assault. It had become a continuous flow of men and material. One of the Allies' greatest engineering achievements soon appeared off the Normandy coast. Because the Germans controlled most major ports, Allied planners knew they could not rely on capturing one immediately after the invasion. Instead, they brought the ports with them. Massive artificial harbours, known as the Mulberry Harbours, were assembled piece by piece across the English Channel. Concrete caissons weighing thousands of tons were floated into position and sunk to create breakwaters. Floating roadways connected ships directly to the shore. Within days, cargo vessels that would otherwise have struggled to unload were delivering enormous quantities of equipment directly onto the beaches. The system was unlike anything attempted before. Even after one of the Mulberry Harbours was severely damaged by a powerful storm later in June, the remaining facilities, together with the beaches themselves, continued handling astonishing amounts of cargo. Every day the Allies grew stronger. Every day Germany's opportunity grew smaller. The skies over Normandy also told a very different story from those of 1940. During the Battle of France 4 years earlier, German aircraft had dominated the battlefield. Now the situation had reversed. Allied fighters and fighter bombers patrolled almost constantly. Whenever German columns attempted to move during daylight, they risked immediate attack. Locomotives pulling military supplies became targets. Fuel trucks were destroyed on country roads. Bridges were bombed. Railway junctions disappeared beneath clouds of smoke and debris. Even when German reinforcements survived these attacks, they often arrived late, exhausted, and with fewer supplies than planned. Logistics, an often overlooked part of warfare, was becoming just as important as combat itself. The Allies could replace damaged vehicles. They could bring in more ammunition. They could rotate exhausted units. Germany found each of those tasks increasingly difficult. Factories inside the Reich continued producing weapons, but getting them to Normandy became a growing challenge. Fuel was limited. Rail networks had suffered months of Allied bombing. Replacement crews often lacked the experience of the soldiers they were replacing. Losses that Germany might have absorbed in 1941 became far more difficult to recover from in 1944. The contrast between the two sides became clearer with each passing week. For every German tank knocked out, replacing it became another struggle. For every Allied tank destroyed, another could often be unloaded from a ship within days. The same pattern applied to trucks, artillery pieces, ammunition, and even food. The battle in Normandy was no longer simply about courage or battlefield tactics. It had become a contest of endurance. And in a war of endurance, the Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in industry, transportation, and logistics. German commanders understood this. Many recognized that time was now working against them. The only realistic hope was to launch a powerful counterattack before the Allied beachheads merged into one continuous front. If they failed to do so, the invasion would become too large to contain. The window for stopping D-Day was rapidly closing. Soon, the question would no longer be whether the Allies could remain in France. It would become how quickly they could break out of Normandy and begin their advance toward Germany itself. Why Germany could no longer stop the invasion. As June turned into July, the nature of the battle began to change. During the first few days after D-Day, Germany still had a narrow opportunity to contain the invasion. If enough armoured divisions could be concentrated quickly, there remained at least a possibility of isolating parts of the Allied beachhead before it expanded. But every day that passed made that task more difficult. The Allies were no longer fighting to survive on a handful of beaches. They were steadily building an army in France. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossed the English Channel. Thousands of tanks and armoured vehicles followed. Millions of tons of fuel, ammunition, food and construction equipment poured into Normandy. What had begun as an invasion was becoming a permanent front. German commanders faced another growing problem. Their divisions rarely fought at full strength. Many units had already suffered years of heavy combat on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, or in Italy. Equipment had been lost faster than it could be replaced. Veteran officers who had survived the early years of the war were becoming increasingly difficult to replace. A division that looked powerful on paper often contained far fewer operational tanks than its official numbers suggested. Some vehicles were waiting for repairs. Others had broken down before reaching the battlefield. Some never arrived because they ran out of fuel. Fuel had become one of Germany's greatest weaknesses. Modern armies depended on enormous quantities of gasoline and diesel. Tanks required it. Trucks required it. Aircraft required it. Without fuel, even the most advanced weapons became little more than stationary machines. By 1944, Germany's fuel supply was under relentless pressure. Synthetic fuel plants inside Germany were frequent targets of Allied bombing campaigns. Oil fields in Romania, one of Germany's most important sources of petroleum, also came under increasing attack. Every destroyed refinery meant less fuel reaching the front. As supplies dwindled, commanders were forced to make difficult choices. Should precious fuel be reserved for tanks? For trucks carrying ammunition? For fighter aircraft defending German cities? There was never enough for everything. Meanwhile, the Allies seemed to possess almost unlimited resources. American cargo ships crossed the Atlantic in enormous numbers. Factories in the United States continued producing aircraft, trucks, tanks, locomotives, rifles, radios, uniforms, and ammunition on a scale unlike anything the world had seen before. Britain maintained a constant flow of supplies across the English Channel. Canada contributed ships, aircraft, armored vehicles, and thousands of soldiers. The Soviet Union, fighting Germany in the east, continued forcing Hitler to divide his military strength between two massive fronts. Germany simply could not concentrate all of its forces against Normandy. Even if Hitler had transferred every available division to France, the Eastern Front would still have demanded enormous resources. The war had become too large for Germany to control. Another factor increasingly favored the Allies: control of the air. Throughout the Normandy campaign, Allied aircraft attacked German troop movements almost continuously. Columns that attempted to travel during daylight often scattered as soon as fighter bombers appeared overhead. Bridges collapsed beneath bombing raids. Railway lines were cut. Communication centers were destroyed. The German army remained dangerous, but moving men and equipment across northern France became slower and more hazardous every week. Some German soldiers later recalled that traveling by day felt almost impossible. Whenever engines could be heard, Allied aircraft often followed. As a result, many movements had to be made at night, reducing the speed at which reinforcements could reach the front. Time again worked in the Allies' favor. Then came another turning point. In late July, the United States launched Operation Cobra *, a major offensive designed to break through the German defensive line west of St. Lo. Before the ground assault began, hundreds of Allied bombers struck German positions. The bombardment was immense. When American forces advanced, they finally broke through defenses that had held for weeks. Once the breakthrough began, events moved quickly. Unlike the slow fighting in the hedgerows, open countryside allowed Allied armored divisions to exploit their superior mobility. German forces struggled to establish a new defensive line. Many units found themselves retreating under constant pressure. Others became trapped as Allied armies advanced from multiple directions. The battle that had begun with uncertainty on the beaches was now becoming a campaign of pursuit. The strategic initiative had passed firmly to the Allies. The question was no longer whether the invasion would succeed. It was how far and how fast the Allied armies could advance before Germany organized another major defense. Looking back, historians often point to D-Day as the decisive moment. But in reality, the invasion's success depended not only on June 6 itself, but on everything that followed. Winning the beaches had been the first challenge. Turning those beaches into a gateway for millions of men and vast quantities of equipment was the achievement that ensured Germany would never again regain control of Western France. The deception that had delayed Germany's response had bought the Allies something even more valuable than territory. It had bought them time. And in war, time can be every bit as decisive as firepower. Did Hitler's delay actually decide D-Day? For decades, historians have debated one question more than almost any other surrounding the Normandy invasion. If Hitler had committed his armored reserves immediately, could Germany have driven the Allies back into the sea? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Several powerful Panzer divisions were held back during the crucial early hours of June 6. Orders were delayed, confusion spread through the German chain of command, valuable time was lost while Allied troops poured ashore. It is tempting to conclude that this hesitation alone decided the battle. The reality, however, is more complicated. There is little doubt that the delay benefited the Allies. Every hour allowed additional soldiers, tanks, artillery engineers, and supplies to reach the beaches. Every landing craft that unloaded successfully made the invasion more difficult to defeat. By the time some German armored formations entered the fighting, they faced an enemy that was already becoming stronger by the hour. Yet historians generally caution against viewing Hitler's delay as the single deciding factor. Even if every available Panzer division had moved at the earliest possible moment, they would still have faced enormous obstacles. The Allies enjoyed overwhelming naval superiority. Battleships stationed offshore could bombard German positions with guns capable of firing shells weighing hundreds of kilograms. Destroyers moved surprisingly close to shore, providing direct fire support whenever German resistance threatened the beachheads. German armored units attacking near the coastline would almost certainly have come under heavy naval gunfire. The Allies also controlled the skies. Thousands of aircraft flew missions over Normandy during the invasion. Fighter bombers searched for moving vehicles. Medium bombers attacked transportation routes. Reconnaissance aircraft continuously reported German movements. Even before reaching the battlefield, German columns risked attack from above. Logistics presented another challenge. Moving large armored formations required fuel, ammunition, maintenance crews, and functioning roads. Many transportation routes had already been damaged by months of Allied bombing. Railways had been cut, bridges destroyed. Traffic congestion became severe as military vehicles, refugees, and damaged equipment crowded the remaining roads. Even the strongest divisions cannot fight effectively if they arrive piecemeal. The German army also faced a shortage that is often overlooked: experienced soldiers. By 1944, many veterans who had fought during Germany's early victories had been killed, wounded, or captured. Replacement troops often received less training before being sent into combat. Some units still fought with remarkable determination, but rebuilding the quality of the army proved increasingly difficult as the war continued. The Allies, meanwhile, possessed another critical advantage. Their commanders expected casualties. The invasion plan had been built around the assumption that losses would be heavy. Replacement units stood ready. Additional equipment waited across the Channel. Medical services, engineers, logistics specialists, and naval support had all been organized months in advance. The invasion was designed not simply to survive the first day, but to continue growing regardless of the inevitable setbacks. This planning reflected one of the Allies' greatest strengths: preparation. Operation Overlord was not merely a landing operation. It represented years of planning, involving millions of people across several nations. Every bridge, every fuel depot, every landing craft, every shipment of ammunition, and every weather forecast formed part of an enormous logistical system. No single German decision could completely erase those advantages. That does not mean Hitler's choices were unimportant. Far from it. His insistence on maintaining personal control over key armored reserves contributed to delays during the invasion. His continued belief that the Pas de Calais remained the likely location of the main Allied assault reinforced Germany's reluctance to commit every available force immediately. But those beliefs did not emerge from nowhere. They were the product of one of the most successful deception campaigns ever conducted. Operation Fortitude had convinced German intelligence that the evidence overwhelmingly pointed toward another invasion still to come. In that sense, Hitler was not acting in complete isolation from reality. He was acting on intelligence that had been carefully shaped by his enemy. The Allies had manipulated what Germany believed. And because Germany believed the deception, its most important strategic decisions were influenced by it. That may have been Operation Fortitude's greatest achievement. It did not force Germany to make irrational decisions. It encouraged Germany to make decisions that appeared rational based on false information. In war, accurate intelligence can save armies. False intelligence can destroy them. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the consequences of those decisions became increasingly impossible to reverse. Paris would soon be liberated. The German army would retreat toward its own borders. And the Third Reich would enter the final chapter of its existence. Conclusion. When people think about D-Day, they often picture the soldiers who fought their way across the beaches of Normandy. The images are unforgettable. Landing craft approaching the shore through rough seas. engineers clearing obstacles under enemy fire, medics treating the wounded while bullets flew overhead, infantry advancing across beaches that only moments before had been swept by machine gun fire. Those acts of courage deserve every bit of recognition they have received. But the story of D-Day did not begin on the beaches. In many ways it began months earlier, in offices filled with maps, intelligence reports, and carefully guarded secrets. Before a single Allied soldier landed in France, another battle had already been fought. It was a battle of deception. The Allies understood that defeating Germany would require more than overwhelming force. They needed to shape what Germany believed. Through Operation Bodyguard and Operation Fortitude, they constructed an elaborate illusion. Fake armies appeared where none existed. False radio messages filled the air. Double agents supplied carefully crafted misinformation. Inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft convinced German reconnaissance that vast armies were preparing to strike somewhere they never intended to attack. The remarkable achievement was not simply creating the deception. It was making the deception believable. The Pas de Calais genuinely appeared to be the most logical invasion site. It offered the shortest crossing, favorable supply routes, and direct access into northern France. German commanders had good reasons to expect the main assault there. The Allies simply reinforced those expectations until they became accepted as fact. When the invasion finally came at Normandy, German leaders faced an impossible decision. Should they commit their reserves immediately, or hold them back for what they believed was still to come? History now tells us that Normandy was the decisive invasion. But on June 6, 1944, that certainty did not exist inside German headquarters. The uncertainty itself became one of the Allies' greatest weapons. Every hour Germany hesitated allowed more Allied soldiers to land. More tanks rolled onto French soil. More artillery reached the front. More supplies crossed the English Channel. The balance shifted steadily, and then permanently. Would the invasion have failed if Germany had reacted differently? No one can answer that question with complete certainty. Some historians believe a faster German response might have inflicted heavier casualties or prolonged the battle. Others argue that Allied naval power, overwhelming air superiority, industrial strength, and meticulous planning had already made success highly likely. What most historians do agree on is that no single event decided D-Day. It was the result of thousands of decisions made over many months. The courage of the soldiers who landed on the beaches, the engineers who designed artificial harbors, the intelligence officers who managed double agents, the code breakers who interpreted enemy communications, the factory workers who built ships, aircraft, and vehicles, the sailors who carried supplies across dangerous waters, the pilots who protected the invasion fleet from above. Each played a role in one of history's most complex military operations. Operation Fortitude remains one of the clearest demonstrations that wars are not won by weapons alone. Information can be just as powerful. A convincing lie, carefully planned and patiently maintained, can influence decisions at the highest level of command. In June 1944, that is exactly what happened. Hitler did not hesitate simply because he ignored reality. He hesitated because reality had been deliberately obscured. The Allies had convinced Germany that the invasion everyone could see was not the one that truly mattered. By the time the truth became impossible to deny, the beaches of Normandy had already become the gateway to the liberation of Western Europe. Less than a year later, Nazi Germany surrendered. The deception had not won the war on its own, but it helped create the opportunity that changed its course forever. And that is why, more than 80 years later, military academies around the world still study Operation Fortitude, not merely as a brilliant deception, but as one of the greatest intelligence operations ever carried out. Because sometimes, the most decisive victory is won long before the first shot is fired.